They did a seismic survey around the Sphinx, and they identified a very large geometrical chamber about 15 feet beneath the forepaws of the Sphinx.
The story begins in 1850 on the Giza Plateau in Egypt, when French archaeologist Auguste Mariette was investigating the ancient ruins surrounding the Great Sphinx. Beneath centuries of drifting sand, the enormous limestone figure slowly emerged from the desert. But even after the monument was cleared, restored, and studied by generations of archaeologists, one question refused to disappear. What else was hidden beneath the Sphinx? Before we go any further, please subscribe to the channel and help us reach our goal of 5,000 subscribers. And what archaeologists would eventually discover beneath the monument would only make that question more mysterious. The Great Sphinx of Giza stands on the western bank of the Nile, just outside modern Cairo. Carved directly from the limestone bedrock, it measures roughly 73 meters, or 240 feet, from paw to tail, and rises about 20 meters, or 66 feet, high. Its human head sits above the body of a powerful lion, creating one of the most recognizable monuments on Earth. For most Egyptologists, the basic story is straightforward. The Sphinx was probably carved during Egypt's 4th dynasty, around 2558 to 2532 BCE, during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre, whose name is also commonly written as Khafra. The monument forms part of a larger architectural complex that includes the Valley Temple and Khafra's pyramid. But the Sphinx has never been an ordinary archaeological site. Long before modern archaeology existed, the monument was already being buried and uncovered by the desert. By the time of the New Kingdom, more than 1,000 years after its original construction, the Sphinx had become an ancient sacred monument whose original builders were already part of the distant past. One of the most important pieces of evidence comes from Thutmose IV, who became pharaoh in the late 15th century BCE. Around 1400 BCE, he placed the famous dream stele between the Sphinx's paws. The inscription describes the young prince falling asleep beneath the monument, while its body was buried beneath sand. According to the story, the Sphinx appeared to him in a dream and promised him kingship if he cleared away the sand covering the monument. Thutmose eventually became pharaoh. The story may contain royal propaganda, but the physical evidence confirms something important. The Sphinx had already become heavily buried long before modern archaeologists ever reached Giza. Then came the modern era. In 1817, Italian explorer and excavator Giovanni Battista Caviglia began serious excavations around the Sphinx. Later, in the 1850s, Auguste Mariette continued archaeological work across the Giza Plateau. But the most extensive early modern clearance came much later. Between 1925 and 1936, French Egyptologist Émile Barrès carried out a massive excavation and restoration campaign around the Sphinx. His workers removed enormous quantities of sand and debris that had accumulated around the monument. And that excavation revealed something crucial. The Sphinx had not simply been carved once and left alone. It had been repaired. Blocks had been added. Damaged sections had been reconstructed. Different generations had attempted to protect the soft limestone from erosion. The monument was, in effect, a geological and archaeological record of thousands of years of human intervention. But then, decades later, archaeologists began looking beneath the surface. By the 1980s and early 1990s, researchers were experimenting with increasingly sophisticated geophysical techniques around the Sphinx enclosure. Instead of immediately excavating, they could send signals into the ground and study how those signals behaved beneath the surface. This changed archaeology. Seismic surveys could reveal changes in the density and structure of the limestone. ground-penetrating radar could identify anomalies beneath the ground without physically removing the stone. And that raised a possibility that had fascinated researchers for generations. What if something was still hidden beneath the Sphinx? The answer appeared in the form of an anomaly. Around the area of the Sphinx's paws, researchers reported subsurface irregularities that appeared different from the surrounding limestone. Some interpretations suggested cavities or spaces beneath the monument. But there was an important problem. A geophysical anomaly is not automatically a chamber. It can represent a natural fracture, a difference in rock density, disturbed sediment, moisture, an ancient excavation, or an actual architectural space. Without excavation or independent confirmation, researchers cannot simply look at a scan and declare that a hidden room exists. And this is where the story becomes far more complicated than the headlines suggest. Modern ground-penetrating radar works by sending electromagnetic pulses into the ground and measuring the signals that return. Different materials produce different responses. Solid limestone behaves differently from loose sediment. A fracture behaves differently from an air-filled cavity. If a large artificial chamber existed beneath the Sphinx, researchers would expect a measurable anomaly. But finding an anomaly is only the first step. To understand what it actually represents, archaeologists would need to compare multiple data sets, map the geometry, analyze the surrounding geology, and determine whether the feature is natural or artificial. That distinction becomes critical because the bedrock beneath the Sphinx is not uniform. The monument was carved from layers of limestone with different physical properties. Some layers are soft and porous. Others are harder and more resistant. Natural fractures also pass through the Giza Plateau. In other words, the Sphinx is sitting on complicated geology, and that geology has already produced some surprising discoveries. In the early 1990s, geologist Robert Schoch became one of the most controversial researchers associated with the Sphinx. Schoch was brought into the debate after writer John Anthony West argued that the erosion patterns surrounding the monument were not primarily caused by wind and sand. West believed the deep rounded channels and vertical weathering patterns looked more consistent with prolonged rainfall. Schoch examined the enclosure and became convinced that water erosion deserved serious consideration. His conclusion was provocative. If the erosion had been produced by prolonged rainfall, then some of the weathering could potentially predate the traditionally accepted 4th Dynasty construction date. That would push the possible age of the Sphinx far deeper into prehistory. The idea was controversial because Egypt's climate was dramatically different thousands of years ago. During the early Holocene, beginning roughly 11,700 years ago, North Africa entered a much wetter period commonly known as the African Humid Period, or the Green Sahara. Instead of the vast desert we see today, parts of the Sahara contained grasslands, lakes, rivers, and seasonal rainfall. Large animals, including cattle, antelope, and other species, could survive across regions that are now almost completely arid. For Schoch's hypothesis to work, the Sphinx would have needed to exist during a much earlier wet period, when heavy rainfall could have flowed repeatedly across the limestone. But there was another problem. The archaeological record does not currently contain evidence for a civilization capable of carving a monument the size of the Sphinx thousands of years before dynastic Egypt. That is why the debate became so intense. The geological evidence appeared to tell one story. The archaeological evidence appeared to tell another, and neither side could simply erase the other. In the early 1990s, geophysicist Thomas Dobecki also conducted seismic investigations around the Sphinx enclosure. His work identified variations in the subsurface limestone and areas of deeper weathering. Some interpretations suggested that weathering penetration differed significantly around different sections of the enclosure. The asymmetry became part of the argument. Supporters of the water erosion hypothesis argued that some portions of the enclosure appeared to have experienced prolonged exposure to water. Mainstream researchers countered that limestone weathering can be produced by several mechanisms, including salt crystallization, moisture, temperature changes, wind, and the natural differences between layers of rock. And this is where the Sphinx becomes something more complicated than a simple mystery. Because even if the Sphinx is exactly as old as conventional archaeology proposes, its surface has been exposed to thousands of years of changing environmental conditions. Salt can migrate through limestone. Moisture can enter microscopic cracks. Temperature changes can expand and contract the stone. Sand can accumulate against the monument. And when moisture evaporates, salt crystals can form inside the pores of the limestone, gradually breaking the surface apart. Modern conservation specialists continue to fight these processes today. So when researchers look at the Sphinx and see weathering, they are not looking at a single event. They are looking at a record created by thousands of years of geological and environmental processes. That is why the age question remains so difficult. The mainstream archaeological position still connects the Sphinx to Khafra's 4th Dynasty complex, around the 26th century BCE. The Valley Temple, quarry relationships, architectural alignment, and the broader Giza complex all support that interpretation. But the water erosion hypothesis has ensured that the question is not completely closed. And somewhere beneath that unresolved debate lies another possibility: a hidden space. If modern scans really have identified a large geometric chamber beneath the paws of the Sphinx, then the first question is not, what treasure is inside? It is much more important. And that is where the strongest counterargument begins. The Sphinx does not exist in a vacuum. Its limestone has been exposed to thousands of years of heat, moisture, salt, sand, and repeated burial. Mainstream Egyptology therefore pushed back against the idea of an extremely ancient Sphinx, and it did so with a mechanism that can actually be observed, measured, and reproduced. The most technically developed explanation centers on salt crystallization, a process known as haloclasty, or salt exfoliation. Egyptian limestone contains soluble salts that, when exposed to moisture and repeated temperature changes, can migrate toward the surface. As the water evaporates, the salts crystallize inside the pores and tiny fractures of the stone. Those growing crystals exert pressure from within, gradually forcing thin layers of limestone to break away. Over thousands of years, that process can produce something surprisingly deceptive. The surface becomes rounded, softened, and deeply weathered, sometimes creating profiles that can look remarkably similar to erosion caused by flowing water. And this is not simply a theoretical explanation invented to defend the conventional date. Salt-driven deterioration has been reproduced under laboratory conditions and documented across numerous Egyptian limestone monuments. By the 1990s, researchers had already demonstrated how salt action could contribute significantly to the kind of deterioration visible across the Sphinx. And there is an important detail here that makes the argument difficult to dismiss. Salt weathering is not merely something that happened to the monument in the distant past. It is still happening. Modern conservation teams continue to monitor the Sphinx because moisture and salt remain among the most serious threats to its limestone. In other words, the same stone that archaeologists are trying to use as evidence of the monument's age is still changing beneath their hands today. But then another complication appears. The Sphinx was not carved from one perfectly uniform block of limestone. It was cut directly from a natural geological formation made up of different layers, and those layers do not weather at the same rate. The lower sections of the body contain softer, more porous limestone, while some of the higher layers are harder and more resistant. That means two surfaces exposed to exactly the same climate can deteriorate at completely different speeds. And this matters when researchers compare the Sphinx to nearby monuments. A neighboring structure may have been constructed from quarried limestone taken from a harder geological layer. The Sphinx, by contrast, remained attached to the softer bedrock beneath it. So, differences in weathering do not automatically prove that the monuments were built thousands of years apart. Then there is the sand. For centuries, sometimes for generations at a time, the Sphinx was buried beneath the desert. Sand protected parts of the monument from direct wind erosion, but it also created another problem. Moisture could become trapped against the limestone, allowing chemical reactions and salt crystallization to continue beneath the surface. It created a strange paradox. The sand that protected the Sphinx from some forms of erosion may also have accelerated other forms of deterioration, and suddenly, the weathering evidence becomes much harder to interpret. Supporters of the older date theory can point to the rounded channels, deep vertical weathering, and apparent differences in erosion across the enclosure. Conventional researchers can point to salt, moisture, geological layering, restoration, and thousands of years of environmental exposure. Both sides have evidence. Neither explanation automatically solves everything. And that uncertainty opened the door to even more radical theories. The extreme claims and the middle ground. Not everyone who believes the Sphinx could be older than the Fourth Dynasty agrees on just how old it might be. Some researchers pushed the idea far beyond Robert Schoch's proposal. In the early 1990s, Ukrainian researchers Vyacheslav Manzhuk and Pavel Manko proposed an interpretation of the enclosure walls that went considerably further. They argued that some of the large horizontal features resembled wave-cut formations, the kind of geological structures created when water repeatedly reaches the same level against a rock surface. Their interpretation suggested that the Sphinx enclosure might have been affected by ancient bodies of water during a much earlier period of Earth's history. The proposed age was extraordinary, potentially around 800,000 years. If that were true, the implications would be enormous. It would place the creation of the monument hundreds of thousands of years before the emergence of dynastic Egypt and far outside the accepted timeline of monumental architecture. But there is a fundamental problem. The limestone itself is not 800,000 years old. The bedrock beneath Giza is Eocene limestone, formed roughly 50 million years ago, long before humans existed. The question is not when the stone was formed. The question is when human beings carved it. And that distinction is critical. An 800,000-year-old carving would require evidence of a population capable of quarrying, shaping, transporting, and organizing monumental stone architecture at a time when there is no accepted archaeological evidence for such a civilization anywhere on Earth. That evidence has not been found. For that reason, the extreme 800,000-year interpretation has not been accepted by mainstream archaeology or geology. But there is a middle ground. Author and researcher Andrew Collins proposed a more measured possibility. Rather than arguing that the entire Sphinx must have been carved hundreds of thousands of years ago, he suggested that the natural rock surface could preserve evidence of much older environmental conditions, while the recognizable human-headed lion was carved at a later date. In that scenario, the rock canvas could be ancient, while the sculpture itself could be younger. And that is a distinction worth remembering. The age of the stone is not the age of the monument. The limestone may have been sitting on the Giza plateau for tens of millions of years before a human being ever touched it. What matters archaeologically is the moment someone began transforming that natural formation into the Sphinx. Collins also raised another possibility. Perhaps the monument we see today was not its original form. Maybe an earlier structure existed on the same rock formation and was later recarved into the human-headed lion we recognize today. At first glance, that sounds almost as speculative as the extreme theories. But there is one reason the idea continues to attract attention. We know the Sphinx was modified. We know ancient Egyptians repaired it. We know later rulers added stonework. We know the monument was buried beneath sand and repeatedly cleared. We know sections of its surface were restored, reconstructed, and altered. The Sphinx, therefore, is not a single moment frozen in stone. It is a monument with layers. The original quarrying created one layer. The carving created another. Ancient weathering added another. New Kingdom restoration added another. Later repairs added more. Modern archaeologists then removed centuries of accumulated sand and replaced damaged sections once again. And that is why any newly discovered chamber has to be treated with extreme caution. A void beneath the Sphinx might belong to the original 4th Dynasty construction. It might have been created during a later restoration. It might be connected to an ancient passage that was subsequently sealed, or it might not be artificial at all. The only way to know is to determine what the stone itself can tell us. Tool marks, mortar, pigments, sediment, construction layers, and, most importantly, the relationship between the chamber and the surrounding bedrock. Because if that hidden space really exists, its age could be far more important than its size. A chamber from the time of Khafra would reinforce the conventional history of the Sphinx. A chamber from the New Kingdom would reveal another chapter in the monument's long history of restoration. And a chamber containing evidence that predates the 4th Dynasty would force archaeologists to confront an entirely different question. Not whether the Sphinx is mysterious. We already know it is, but how much of its story have we still not discovered? A layered history of survival. The Sphinx hasn't simply stood still for thousands of years. Its surface tells a layered story of damage, neglect, burial, and repair, and understanding that history matters enormously for interpreting any new discovery inside it. The large clearance project of the 1920s and 1930s, led by French Egyptologist Émile Barrès, was the most systematic modern excavation of the monument. Barrès's team documented masonry repair layers from multiple distinct historical periods. New Kingdom pharaohs, particularly Thutmose IV and Amenhotep II, added significant limestone casing blocks to stabilize the eroding body. Additional repairs came during the Sate period, roughly 600 BCE. The Greco-Roman era added more. Modern conservation work in the 20th century used cement patches that, in some cases, didn't survive contact with the stone and had to be replaced. The Dream Stele, the carved stone tablet placed between the Sphinx's front paws by Pharaoh Thutmose IV around 1401 BCE, records that the young prince fell asleep in the Sphinx's shade, while the monument was heavily buried in sand. In a dream, the Sphinx promised him the throne of Egypt if he cleared the sand away. He did, and he became pharaoh. The stele is part royal propaganda and part historical record. It tells us that, by the New Kingdom, the Sphinx was already understood as ancient, sacred, and in need of care. It's a paradox of preservation. The thing that hid the monument also damaged it. This layered repair history is central to interpreting the newly discovered chamber. Any void found beneath or within the Sphinx today could belong to any phase of the monument's construction or restoration: the original Old Kingdom project, a New Kingdom repair program, a Sate-era intervention, or even a much later modification. Without careful documentation of tool marks, mortar types, masonry styles, and pigment chemistry, it is impossible to assign a date. Emile Beres's earlier excavations and subsequent work by the Egyptian Antiquities Organization's Sphinx Mapping Project in the 1980s and 1990s have already revealed stairways and passages that were subsequently resealed. The Sphinx has a documented history of interior modification. The new chamber fits that pattern, but determining where it sits within that pattern requires exactly the kind of methodical investigation that sensational headlines tend to skip. Myths of the Sphinx's underworld. Once you start talking about hidden chambers, you open a door to one of archaeology's most persistent mythology factories. Stories about secret tunnels, doorways, and underground passages beneath the Sphinx have circulated since the early 1800s, and almost all of them dissolve on contact with the actual evidence. The year 1837 comes up constantly in online discussions, usually attached to some story about French explorers finding a hidden entrance and covering it up. Here is what actually happened. It wasn't a French team, and there wasn't a doorway. A British expedition led by Colonel Richard William Howard Vyse and his engineer, John Shea Paring, drilled a hole into the back of the Sphinx, directly behind the head. The drill rods jammed at about 27 feet. When the team tried blasting them free, they damaged the surrounding stone. When archaeologists cleared the area again in 1978, they found a fragment of the Sphinx's headdress in the debris left by that 19th century drilling. No tunnel, no passage, just the scar from an excavation that should have been done more carefully. Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass, two of the most experienced Egyptologists who have worked the Giza Plateau, did confirm the existence of a small, rough tunnel carved into the northwest side of the Sphinx's rump. Before excitement builds, the critical detail: it doesn't go anywhere. It appears to be the work of treasure hunters or looters, not original builders, and it connects to nothing. What about the 2019 headlines announcing secret tunnels under Giza? That's a case study in how scientific findings get mangled in translation. Those discoveries were inside the Great Pyramid of Khufu, not the Sphinx. In 2017, the Scan Pyramids project, using muon imaging, a technique that uses cosmic ray particles to detect density variations inside stone, announced a large void inside Khufu's pyramid. In 2023, the team revealed a short corridor, approximately 30 feet long, hidden above the main entrance. In 2024, another research group reported a shallow anomaly in the sand north of the pyramid. These are real findings. They have nothing to do with the Sphinx. The Osiris shaft, an impressive multi-level underground structure that actually does exist on the Giza Plateau, is another source of confusion. You access it through a vertical shaft cut into the bedrock beneath Khafra's causeway. It descends through multiple levels with side chambers, eventually reaching a lower room that floods at the water table. Hawass published a full account of it. It's dramatic and genuinely ancient, but it sits under Khafra's causeway, not under the Sphinx, and the two structures are not connected. The cave systems described by Andrew Collins near an area north of the plateau known as the Tomb of the Birds represent a different category of claim. Collins proposed that shallow cavities in that area might indicate a larger cave network beneath the plateau. In 2009, Hawass responded directly, confirming the existence of shallow cavities, while rejecting the claim that they constituted a massive underground city or any structure connected to the Sphinx. The site was sealed for conservation purposes. Collins kept the idea alive in his publications. The official archaeological position is that these are minor natural cavities, not a hidden underworld. And then there is Edgar Cayce. Cayce was an American clairvoyant active in the early 20th century who claimed, while in trance, that survivors of Atlantis had buried their sacred records in a hall of records located beneath the Sphinx. He identified the right paw area specifically. Cayce produced no evidence. His claims were not based on any archaeological data, but they caught the public imagination and have been reprinted, referenced, and amplified for decades. They persist in documentaries, books, and online discussions as though they carry some evidentiary weight. They don't, but they demonstrate something important about why the Sphinx attracts this kind of myth-making in the first place. It is a monument that genuinely does have an incomplete history. It genuinely does have unresolved questions about its age and origin. And it genuinely does have features, including a newly discovered chamber that legitimate researchers cannot yet fully explain. That real uncertainty creates space for imagination to fill. The problem is that myth and mystery tend to crowd out the more careful work. The secrets written on its face.